session. So we'll be going through accelerating API problem resolution with API monitoring. To give you a quick intro or background on who we are. So my name is Saoirse Hanksman. I had mentioned that before. I'm a marketing manager here at SmartBear, and I also have Dennis with me. If you want to go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Dennis Goodwin. I am the product owner for AlertSite. So I cover all things monitoring here at SmartBear.
All right, awesome. And so just to give you guys, I know that a lot of you are probably familiar with SmartBear, but just to give those of you who are not as familiar, a quick background on us. We were founded in 2009. We've now grown to have 11 offices around the world with over 22,000 customers, 6.5 million users. And we also have 5 free tools. So some of the most common ones that you may be familiar with are the Swagger specification, now known as the Open API specification, and SOAP UI. So we're behind those 2 open source tools. We also have a couple other free tools like Swagger Inspector. So if you guys are familiar with any of those, we are the team behind that. And additionally, I know that some of you may be familiar with some of our individual products, but we do have a variety of different tools that span across the entire software development lifecycle. So from design with either hip test, so both on the UI and API side. So if you're into BDD, you might be familiar with hip test, Swagger Hub, test management with Zephyr. Some of the other tools that you may be familiar with, obviously I mentioned a little bit before, but SOAP UI Pro or Swagger Hub. So we have a bunch of different tools depending on what you're looking to do and what challenges you're trying to solve. Today, we'll be talking more about AlertSite. So on the right side of the screen, you can see that over there. We'll be talking about AlertSite. I'll give a little bit of background on SOAP UI Pro and maybe Load UI Pro, probably not though, and Service V as well, since they're all part of the Ready API suite. And then we'll be talking a little bit about how you can use Swagger Hub with AlertSite as well. So to go over what we're going to be talking about today, first of all, I'm going to go over API monitoring, sort of what is it, give you guys a little bit of context. Then we'll go through how you can better craft an API monitoring strategy, and then how you can actually execute that. So when you're going through, what are you looking for in your API monitoring runs? What do those look like, first of all? And then how do you set all of those up? So we'll go into AlertSite, into the platform, and show you guys how to get started. And obviously, we'll run through any questions that you guys have. But I do want to point out there's a Q&A function and a chat function within Zoom. So if at any point you guys have any questions, feel free to shoot them in there and I'll try to get to them as fast as I can. And if I don't get to them in that exact moment, I'll definitely go through them when we have time for questions at the end. So let's get started. So real quick, what is API monitoring? I kind of wanted to go over this because I think that there's some terms thrown around that sometimes it gets a little bit confusing, but what we're going to be talking about or referring to from an API monitoring standpoint is the practice of monitoring API behavior, most commonly in production, to gain visibility into availability, performance, and functional correctness. And so essentially what API monitoring aims to do is to avoid sort of the situation on the right-hand side of the screen where something gets broken and nobody knows what happened. Then you have to go back in and try and fix that problem. And it just becomes really difficult when you don't have any insight into what's going on. And a lot of the times we've had conversations with either just customers or prospects or people that we talk to, trying to really understand, why does API performance matter? Why is this something that teams should be concerned with, even if you're not necessarily an API development team? Like, let's say if you're developing something on the UI side that sort of relies on APIs on the back end, it's still something that you need to be concerned with. And the reason for this is because API consumers now have high expectations for API providers when it comes to handling quality and performance issues. And so recently, we did a State of API survey, which we had published that maybe you guys are familiar with, maybe you're not, but I'll run through some of those results here just to kind of give you guys some insight on what's going on in the marketplace and what are people expecting, how are people solving problems within their current teams. And so we actually found that 57% of API consumers expect providers to resolve issues within 1 day, and 40% expect them to be resolved within 12 hours. And so for teams, that puts a lot of pressure on both the operations teams and sort of the test QA and developers to make sure that not only do you have a handle on the problems that are going on in production, but then you can go back and fix them quickly. And so some of the reasons, or I guess drivers behind why API performance matters from a business perspective and from a team perspective is that you can lose customers. That kind of trickles into damaging brand perception, right? So if you are known for having terrible performance, people aren't necessarily going to look to you to partner or to rely on for business critical needs. Additionally, there's more team-centric sort of consequences like losing time, losing resources, having to dedicate or reprioritize things when you find issues in production. And it can impact internal productivity. You can violate SLAs, which goes back to sort of the top issue there for losing customers, and so on and so forth. There are a ton of bad things essentially that can happen when your performance degrades. And so this brings us to why would teams want to monitor an API or a series of APIs? And we actually found that organizations that view API monitoring as a top priority are vastly outperforming those that don't. And so when we asked how long it takes to resolve performance issues, 63% said that they resolve performance issues within the first 24 hours. And when we looked at the organizations that were able to do that, the group that stood out were those that were monitoring their APIs. So 76% of respondents that said that they had a formal API monitoring process and that monitoring is a top priority for them were able to resolve performance issues within the first 24 hours. And 18% of those people were able to resolve the issues in an hour or less, which is I think that's pretty incredible. Definitely something that kind of supports the fact that this isn't necessarily just a theory anymore, that this is important or it's something that you should include in your process. It's actually backed up by data by teams that are currently reprioritizing what they're doing. And I know that this is just sort of a visual representation of what I just said, right? So teams that are able to actively monitor their APIs and have that listed as a priority are able to solve issues way faster than those that are not monitoring and it's not a priority for them. So really quickly, I kind of wanted to just shoot out this poll. And if you guys want to participate, feel free. I'll leave it open for a little bit just so that you guys can share some answers. But I kind of wanted to get a feel for what you guys are going through and if you have challenges with your team currently trying to solve problems, because I know that just in talking with our customers and people that prospects that are looking to start monitoring their APIs, the biggest obstacles that they find are really trying to understand what the problem is, right? Like, where is this coming from? And I think the first two bullet points here are kind of related, where it's saying you can't really understand the root cause of the problem. And then being able to identify the API as the actual issue is something that takes them a lot of time. So if you were able to sort of narrow that down quickly, get past that hump, that would be something that would empower your teams to solve the problem fast. These three things, the reason why I kind of wanted to highlight this is because implementing an API monitoring strategy, more specifically using a synthetic monitoring tool, it really helps you address all three of those problems. So I'll go through the next slide actually before.
And Saoirse, one thought on this too.
Yeah, go for it.
So part of the kind of interesting element here is sometimes these APIs are kind of standalone. They're the actual, product, if you will, or the interface, but many times these APIs are supporting either a web or a mobile application. So, monitoring the API directly, just doing that can help isolate root cause if you're monitoring the API in conjunction with the web front end. So there's a lot of value in getting that root cause just by the nature of having the monitors on the APIs as well as on the front end application.
If I can piggyback on that.
Before you do, we should say we have an interloper here too. We also have Amber from our sales engineering organization who is joining us as well.
Hi there. So if I can piggyback on that, I can't tell you how many times I heard somebody say, oh, we don't need to do API monitoring. We're monitoring the front end. And then their tune changes real quick when they have a problem, and trying to identify it in the overall response becomes tricky. There's a big difference between identifying a problem with the application and identifying a problem at the API layer. If you're targeting the API specifically, the information that you have will be API focused, which is so much more helpful in resolving issues.
It's so, so true. So this is kind of why we're highlighting this today, right? Like, I think a lot of teams that, for example, a team that is very API centric might be more attuned to the idea of monitoring and understanding like what benefit that can bring. But if you're not, it acts as like, I guess we'll go over this too in the next couple of slides, but it becomes pretty challenging to understand like, how do I even get started with API monitoring? And sometimes it's a matter of team structure, team breakdown, workflows, and there's sort of this idea that it's very challenging, which I'll address in a couple of slides actually, just to go through that. But it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. And so, just to kind of reiterate and highlight what API monitoring can provide teams. First of all, it helps verify that your APIs are up and performing, that they're returning the right data, which both of those two things address the top two challenges that we just talked about. And then the third bullet would be making sure that everybody or the right people are in the loop about the API problems before they impact end users. And that addresses the third issue that are the third top problem that people experience when they're trying to resolve API issues is like, you don't know who to engage and when to engage them and how to make sure that that information is passed correctly. And it's not necessarily like a game of telephone, right? Monitoring tools basically are able to eliminate those top three problems, especially if you set up your instance correctly or you make sure that you select a tool that works well for your team. It can be the easiest process ever to be able to say like, oh, we have something that's going wrong. The right people are alerted. They know before anything is able to really spiral out of control, and then they can push that back and make sure that they fix that issue faster, which is kind of highlighted in the sense that with what we went over earlier, where teams are able to resolve issues in less than an hour. It's like once you have that process set up, once you're able to understand how that works and integrate it really into your whole development lifecycle, it becomes easy to amplify the feedback that you get and make sure that you're continuously improving with your performance. And I'm going to set out another poll. So I'll end this one. Thanks guys for responding. So it seems like a lot of people on the line at least have challenges with solving performance issues, which is not something that's surprising. I think a lot of teams experience that, which is kind of why we wanted to go through this. So let me just ask you guys really quickly, just to get a feel for the audience and what you guys are doing currently, because I don't want to run through things that may not be of value to you guys. So, ooh, we have a solid 50-50 split here. This is fun. I like this one.
Sounds about right.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, it's changing rapidly. This is awesome.
And we do mean APIs specifically, not just monitoring your UI, and there's some APIs behind that, so technically we're monitoring those too.
Directly monitoring APIs.
Yeah.
Maybe should have been the wording here.
Yeah, sorry about that, guys.
Okay.
Are you directly
got
monitoring? That was definitely my bad. Man, it's very, very close. 50-50. Okay, so that's good for us to know anyway, just so when we're going in and explaining stuff. So,
but that also validates there's a bit of a gap between sort of the web side of things and the API side of things. It's closing for sure, but there are definitely more unmonitored APIs out there than there are unmonitored websites.
yes.
And I suspect that in the next couple of years, that gap will close, and I would expect it to line up with the web.
I think that we're kind of getting there. I think that people are now starting to realize that the value that it can bring, and the fact that I'll go over this actually. Like, I think a lot of teams struggle with being able to prioritize this and understand how to get started within their organization. And part of this is like, I think there's this mental block where depending on the structure of your team, it sounds like another thing that you have to do. And it becomes this like, oh, like now you're telling me I have to do like another thing on top of what I'm already doing. Like, why do I need to do that? And I think it also is in part the tools that you rely on and the way that your teams are set up. So for example, if you had a team that is a little bit more siloed and you're using tools that are more developer centric, and your ops engineers are the ones that are sort of responsible for setting up those monitors. For an API, that can be something that's kind of intimidating and scary. And if you're not as intimately involved with the development of that API, it can be kind of a blocker or a wall that you have to run through. So just making sure that you're selecting the right tool is something that's really important. So being able to, if let's say that is the case and your developers aren't necessarily the ones responsible for setting up those monitors, like you want to make sure that you can pick a tool that anyone can really get in and get started, and it doesn't have to be something that's super complex. You don't have to dig into a lot of scripts. You can just get started and make sure that you have the right, you're monitoring the right path of API calls, making sure that you're verifying the data that comes back without it being sort of this huge challenge. But I thought this was something that was super interesting just to show, where it says that, I've talked about, we surveyed a bunch of people for our State of API survey, and we found that 86% of organizations either plan to have a formal API monitoring process, but only a third say that it's a top priority. And so you can just see the breakdown of like people that are trying to get started, people that are not really prioritizing it, and they don't really know. I think it's something that is key to highlight, and maybe that's the case for your team, maybe it's not. I think based on, let's relook at this poll real quick. Oh my gosh, every time I look, it keeps moving and it goes back to 50-50. So it seems like it makes a lot of sense where people are trying to get started. Some people are not trying to get started, they don't really know how. So that's what we're here for.
Pretty much mirrors these numbers.
Yeah, exactly. That, I think that's something that's
yes and
pretty cool.
Pretty close to 50-50 here too.
Yeah, I think that's pretty cool. All right, so let's move this. Sorry about that. Okay, so I wanted to just go over really quickly how teams can get started. So what is that process when you're trying to understand, like, what is an API monitoring strategy? How do you set it up for your team? And what are some of the things that you should prioritize, some of the steps you should prioritize over others when you're trying to evaluate what to do? And so I think the first most important aspect is really understanding who the key stakeholders are. So making sure that you understand what the business impact of the APIs that you're trying to monitor are, and really making sure that you have more of a holistic view of API performance. So making sure that you align business metrics, or align the KPIs or metrics that you're tracking to business objectives, making sure that you're able to report against SLAs, or even just in this step, recognizing like, hey, this is what I should be doing because this is how it rolls up to our bigger sort of overarching strategy as a business.
So one thing on this too, because the APIs aren't necessarily the end product, a lot of times that's sort of the main reason they fall to the side, if you will, and that there's no one really responsible for monitoring them because they're viewed as kind of subservient to the UI that they support. So the companies that we see that treat those APIs kind of on equal terms with the UI layer are the ones who kind of have the monitoring in place of those APIs directly. And this makes a lot more sense to them. The folks who don't, I think even this first step becomes a problem because it isn't clear who's responsible for them in production or how they're being, treated and observed in production because they're not viewed as kind of independent entities.
I think that's a good point too, is understanding the teams that need to be looped in, or what, in theory, what would your ideal process be when something happens, and who, basically making sure that you explicitly delegate responsibilities. And somebody raises their hand and says like, okay, I'm going to hold myself accountable for this and I want to be involved when something goes wrong. The second one would be to assess what your current architecture is. So what are the gaps or the blind spots that you feel that you currently have? And I think this will be different for every team. This is something that I think you can do based off of your current experience, like any of the issues that you have that you've found, okay, this took us forever, why did this take so long to fix? What were some of the things that if we could have had visibility into, it would have been a lot easier and a lot faster to get the problem solved? I think another good thing to do in this step is really understand, do you have different geographical locations that are of importance to your specific team or your organization that you need to know are going to be performing at all times. And maybe that's not the case. Maybe it's just really everywhere, and that's okay too. But just making sure that you take the time to assess that and understand, are there specific places that I should be monitoring from that are either more important or just as important as what you're doing currently. And then another factor of this is really understanding, do you have public facing and internal APIs that you want to monitor? And then understand basically what you don't know about what's going on with those. So understanding the best way to capture information and understanding the best way to carve out a solid path for visibility within your architecture is important.
And, just on that note, it's good to not assume that folks know what APIs are supporting what functions in a product, in a web interface or on a mobile app, because that's not necessarily a given. And that's another reason why you get these APIs kind of orphaned in the monitoring strategy, because people don't really even know how the APIs support the functions that the end users are actually, using. So I think that's going to fit in a little bit with the next couple of pieces here in this picture, but it's part of the architecture is just understanding how the APIs support the customer-facing applications. And then obviously that bleeds directly into this next one, right?
Yeah, so this is actually the exact next step, is understanding what APIs are you really trying to have visibility into. And I think there's also an element here of understanding the risk associated with those APIs. So I know that there's this idea like you can't test everything and you can't monitor everything. At the end of the day, as much as you would like to do that, it's a matter of priority. And so understanding what the risk is with either testing and monitoring this or not testing and monitoring this is really, really important. And you know what, in that, just to even strike what I just said, it may not be the case that you are going to test and monitor the same things. Often it will be, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes there's just things that exist in your production environments that you're kind of ignoring from a test perspective, but are really important to the business. And so making sure that you identify those and sort of highlight those as something that you need to have an eye on at all times, or a constant pulse of how it's doing, is really important. And then Dennis kind of alluded to this earlier too, but try and understand how to set up your monitoring sort of structure or strategy based off of what an end user would experience. Because what are some of the, and maybe this involves looping in different departments too. Maybe it's looping in product, maybe it's looping in your marketing team and saying like, hey, these are the paths that are most commonly used, or these are the ones, maybe it's not the ones that are most commonly taken or used, but it's the ones that have a high risk or a high value to the business, and knowing like, hey, if this checkout function, for example, is not working, this is an easy example, I feel like everyone would know this, but if that's not working, like that's going to cost us a lot of money and that's going to do a lot of damage. So think about what are some of the ways that users or real life people would go in and interact with those APIs. And like we had mentioned, that may not be directly, it may be something that is a function on the back end, but it does support a key process for your organization. Just making sure that you think about that view or those steps is important as well.
And on this note, this is a similar kind of concept to monitoring the transactions on the website, for example. The notion of hitting the front door of a website and assuming everything's great is sort of the analog here would be hitting the main endpoint of an API and not doing anything with it. So APIs can have the same kind of multi-step flavor, where there's dependencies on elements from step one that then get used in step two. So there is a user journey in an API, whether or not the user's aware of it or not, or even the folks on the operations team monitoring the websites are aware of it. Those APIs have similar user journeys. Sometimes the API, has the journey directly. Sometimes it's controlled more in the UI, and those steps are executed kind of independently. So you need to understand how that works. And I'll show an example in a little bit of how to, have a multi-step kind of chained sequence of steps in purely an API fashion, but understanding the interplay between the APIs and the UIs is critical here. But APIs can have user journeys just like websites can. I think that's the takeaway here. But you need to understand how your application is working with those APIs to really kind of set these things up.
And this, in my experience, is one of the biggest challenges around creating a successful API monitoring strategy. And I'll give you an example. So I was working with a popular sort of retail price checking coupon adjustment app. And they were trying to develop a strategy for the way that things are most used and what APIs are important for them to monitor. And they weren't really necessarily thinking about what the customers were using their API for. They were looking at, okay, well, we've got an API that goes and checks the price at several different things. But what they weren't looking at was that a lot of the customers who were using that particular app were using it not just to price check things, but to purchase things. So they had a big problem. They had a lot of people complaining, and they had a big issue with an API, and they couldn't isolate it because they didn't know what was wrong, because they weren't looking at the way the end users were using the app. And the API, at the end of the day, the problem ended up being the add to cart API, because there was an API that went out to a popular retailer that allowed you to click the add to cart button from the third-party app. And that API was broken, but nobody was looking at the fact that users were actually doing that. So they were looking at their own APIs, and they missed that one completely. So it is very, very important to figure out what your end users are doing most commonly and to monitor based on that rather than development effort.
And this is something that, like, that information, I know that sounds like kind of intimidating, but this is information that your organization will have. And it may not be your team, but I am a big proponent of trying to reach out to the teams that would have this information so you don't end up wasting time sort of recreating the wheel. So in that case, like, a perfect example of who to reach out to would have been like the person who manages, so let's say like your webmaster or even your demand gen team within your marketing team. They have all those mapped out and they track all those KPIs. So it's super easy to go into, like, for example, if I was on that team, if I was on that demand gen team, I could be like, yeah, no problem. Let me run into Google Analytics or any of the sort of tracking systems that you use. Maybe if it's within an application, you would use something like Mixpanel or Pendo. You could go in and be like, hey, I know that users are taking these steps. This is the amount that they do every day. Like, we have these unique sessions. Like, what's going on here? Like, this is what you should be keeping an eye on, because this is what our users are trying to do most frequently. And this is sort of the path that brings us the most value from that perspective. But I definitely think it's important to highlight, like, definitely monitor not just the API endpoints, but the transactions. And I think something that people may forget to do is making sure that the data that comes back within those transactions is correct. So an example of how to do that would be to make sure to add in assertions, or if you need to carry over pieces of information, maybe it's like a session ID, something like that, from call to call, make sure that you're able to do that as well. Otherwise, you end up getting this idea. We talked about this in a couple other sessions, but this idea of the illusion of availability, where, like, you'll have something come back that, oh, yep, we hit this and it's up. But it doesn't matter if it's up and it's not returning the right information, or it's acting funky, or it's slow. So just making sure that you're able to have visibility into that as well is something that's super key.
Despite what some would have you believe, 200 is not always okay.
Classic.
That's a good one. But yeah, it is true. It is actually very true. So just making sure that you keep that in mind. And then I kind of alluded to this a little bit earlier, but making sure that you pick a tool that works for your team and your workflows is something that's super essential. I kind of highlighted it earlier, but if you're a team that is pretty siloed and you don't have very, like, developer centric people on your ops team trying to script an API, like, that's not going to work. It's not going to scale. You're not going to be able to do it successfully, and it's going to take people a lot of time. So just trying to make sure that you understand, like, what your needs are is super important. So, and another thing that we literally just talked about, but make sure that you can have a tool that allows you to get the visibility that you need. So if you need to monitor API transactions and you need to make sure that the data that's coming back is right, make sure that you pick a tool that can help you do that. Don't just try and run into it because it looks easy and it's cheap. That often leads to sort of some problems down the line. So just take the time to make sure you test it out, make sure it works for you, and make sure that you can get what you need to get done, get the information that you need. And then lastly, I would make sure.
One point,
go for it.
It kind of relates to these last two, but be aware of what your other teams are using from a development and a QA perspective, because there may be artifacts there that can be reused to make the monitoring easier to set up. It may not have to be done from scratch. So that's an important piece as well.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that kind of bleeds into this last step, which would be to integrate with the tools that you have. And the reason why I say this is not even necessarily just because it sounds cool, like, oh, make it a seamless process, right? But no, I think it's really important to make sure that, for example, an alert perspective is a really great example. Like if you have a tool set up and you're already using another tool for your alerts, definitely integrate that into what you're already doing. Most monitoring tools will be able to do that, so that you don't have to sort of like rework what you're doing or what you're used to try and incorporate another type of monitoring within your workflow. It's not something that should be a challenge. And so I think another element of this that I wanted to highlight too is being able to test and monitor in sequence, or in parallel, I guess is the proper word, is something that's super, super valuable. So a lot of teams that we work with are doing this currently. I know a lot of teams are trying to move toward this whole idea of embracing observability and being able to have constant sort of feedback loops, being able to make sure that everyone's looped into the right sort of data and knows what's going on and how they can iteratively improve and what they should be spending their time on is something that's super important. And once you're able to do that, I think your teams are able to function a lot better, you're able to recover a lot better, and you have a good idea of where you stand basically at all times. So just keeping that in mind when you're trying to understand what to do when you're trying to get started with API monitoring, something that's really valuable. And this is just an example from a SmartBear perspective. Obviously, that's something, the tools that we work with every day. But really getting a feel for how monitoring can be a part of your life cycle. I think a lot of the times this is something that is thrown in at the end where it's like, oh, well, we tested all this stuff. It's already in production. Like, we should get monitor set up. It's like, at that point, it doesn't need to be that siloed. It doesn't have to be, I think at that point, when you get to that mindset, it becomes a lot harder actually to begin setting up your monitors and making sure that you're in sync basically with all of your other teams. So if you're able to incorporate this into your workflows, into your CI or CD pipelines, it becomes something that is really, really helpful. And so just to explain a little bit about what's going on here, you could basically, so the yellow icons over here are our API testing tools. So one of them would be SOAP UI Pro or Load UI Pro. So within there, you can functionally test, load test your APIs, all that good stuff. You can virtualize them if you want as well. But if you're able to take that process and loop it in with your monitor creation and with your monitor runs, you'll be a lot more successful in the end, because it doesn't require you to basically rework the work that's already been done. So you can take those test cases and use them to create new monitors within AlertSite. And then let's say a step fails in production. You have that step already laid out, and you can go back to your test team and be like, hey, like, this is what's going on. This is the information that we got back. We need to fix this. Let's rerun it and reproduce the problem and try and make sure that we get this out as quickly as possible. And so teams that are enabled to do that type of thing are able to fix sort of very complex problems in a very short amount of time. That was that 18% of people that are able to sort of fix that within an hour and get it back out and make sure that everything's all set. This is the type of way that they look at monitoring. It's not necessarily an end of the life cycle like process. It's a continuous process between testing and monitoring so that you can get more data back and continue to improve on your performance in general.
And in this picture, you have release, deploy, monitor. And so historically, people would tend to think of that from the production environment only. But this cycle can live in multiple environments. And we're seeing more folks, monitoring pre-production. And all that really means is that there's monitoring built in at the end of that cycle. And that cycle is happening in multiple environments, kind of concurrently as new versions of the application are developed and move forward. So it's really just a mentality shift, if you will, that the monitors have value in pre-production, kind of in twofold. One, they're going to tell you some more things about the application than you're going to get from just pure functional testing. You're also going to be testing the monitoring at the same time to make sure that the monitors will work when you go live. A lot of times what we see is folks will roll out a release, the monitors will all blow up. They'll get massive, alert swarms, and that's because they're not looking at these applications until they get to prod. So there's value in monitoring at least the staging environments for sure, with the same monitors you're using in production to make sure that they'll keep working, but also that the app is not radically changing from a performance standpoint either coming out.
And so I actually just I know that 50% of people said that they are currently monitoring their APIs. So if you guys want to answer this, this is the last poll, I swear. So if you guys want to participate, go ahead. I'd love to get your feedback. But we know that from a SmartBear perspective, this is the case for a lot of the customers that we have. Like they'll be using, let's say, SOAP UI or Ready API, and then they'll also use AlertSite to monitor their APIs so that they truly have that process that Dennis was talking about, where like they're not worried about kicking off or deploying something because they already have a pulse or an eye on like what is going to happen. And if something changes, they already have their monitors updated as well, because that's already been done within their functional testing process. So this is kind of interesting. So we have some people saying yes, but most people are saying that they don't currently monitor pre-production environments, which I don't think is surprising either. I think a lot of teams are only just sort of getting this idea into their head. A lot of teams that are equipped to do that do it because they can.
What was the percentage? Sorry.
So currently we have 33% saying yes and 67% saying no.
It's even higher. I would have guessed lower, so that's good. But
lower of yes or lower of
lower? I would have thought it'd be less than a third.
Yeah.
To be honest, but what we're seeing is the folks who do this the most are the ones who are getting killed in production when their application teams roll out a new version. We have one customer in particular that their app team likes to change the flow of the login process. I use this example all the time, but it's big telecommunications company. But the login page changes. They ask for the password, the secret code, the username, and all different. They keep changing the order, and it breaks the monitors constantly. And these guys have, usually Sunday night at midnight or something, the release goes out, and all the monitors break, and they roll into Monday morning with no monitoring because everything's red. So so they're now looking at some, internal monitoring solutions so they can get their staging environment monitored so they don't get caught with this. And at least they catch it on like Thursday or whatever instead of on Sunday night. But I think that's a big driver for it from the ops team's perspective. And then the folks who are really embracing DevOps are looking at programmatically configuring, creating, and modifying the monitors and making it part of the process kind of in a more automated fashion. That's where you're seeing those are the two drivers, I think, for shift left that we're seeing right now.
Right. I think it's easier too once you have, like, let's say those teams. So I know the example that you're talking about, and it's like, well, they're able to do this because they spent the time making sure that the tools that they selected are able to support their teams now in monitoring in pre-production environments, which makes it a lot easier, and it makes it a lot more seamless from a team communication perspective as well, where it's like, okay, now I know that I don't have to run back and be like, oh my God, you're breaking all my monitors. What are you doing? You need to tell me this. It's like, they don't even have to have that conversation anymore because they're able to just do it without having to sort of rework the entire wheel and being like, oh, you can't tell me, you can't deploy before you tell me because all of my things are going to break. It becomes a lot easier basically, and communication and collaboration ends up benefiting from that as well. Okay. So it looks like more people are responding. So now it's 44% yes and 56% no.
Are monitoring pre-production?
Yeah.
Wow.
You guys
That's
go.
awesome.
Getting it.
Color be skeptical, Batman, but
That's funny.
but that's good. I like it.
Okay, so just really quickly, the last thing that I wanted to highlight before we jump into some more practical stuff is just being able to do this very quickly. I think it's important to highlight the fact that you can reuse things that you already have. So again, I'm going to do it from a SmartBear perspective just because that's what we're familiar with, but this may be different in your team. But you can reuse some of the things that you've already created. So for example, if you wanted to monitor your APIs, you can take your open API specification, use that to create a monitor within AlertSite without having to script anything, code anything, go in and dig a bunch of stuff up. You can do that automatically. And same goes for your functional tests within SOAP UI or Ready API, which is something that's really, really helpful when you're trying to move quickly, get up and running, and not sacrifice quality or have to be able to be confident in saying that, like, yeah, I know that my monitors are catching what they need to be catching. I feel like there was one other thing that I wanted to address before we jump into this, but I can't remember. So if I remember that, then I'll bring that back up. But let me just close this poll really quick. All right. So this is sort of the bulk of what we wanted to talk about. I know that we're running up on time too, so I'll make sure that we look at those. But basically, we wanted to go over sort of a real life example of, like, visually, why does API monitoring matter? How can you get that data back and use that to your benefit? So I'm going to hand it over to Dennis. We can get started within AlertSite. So for those of you that aren't familiar with AlertSite, AlertSite is SmartBear's synthetic monitoring tool. So you can monitor on both your API layer and your UI layer super easily. I know that we talked about reusing stuff, but like if you wanted to reuse your open API specification or your functional test scripts from within SOAP UI, you can do that. But you can also do it just by pasting the endpoint URL. You don't have to go in and code or script a long sort of series of calls and making sure that you validate the responses that come back. You can do that all within the AlertSite console without having to script. So it's something that's super easy to use, very easy to get started, and it's super clear when something goes wrong as well. So we'll go into how you get started with that and what that looks like. So I'll hand over the baton to you, Dennis, and you can share your screen, and then we can run into AlertSite and see how to do that.
All right. So we'll see some of what's on the screen now live.
And then I know that we had some questions come in. So if you guys have any more questions, keep sending them in, and I will send over some answers, or I'll just answer them live. I'll try and do it at the same time.
All right. I've been answering a few, so I think we're in pretty good shape as you've been talking.
Okay, cool.
All right. So I'm not going to do a full-blown AlertSite demo here, but I'll try to touch on some key things so it'll be valuable for both AlertSite customers and non-AlertSite customers. So what you're looking at here is the AlertSite dashboard. I've got a view of just a bunch of API monitors that I've got in my account. And I've got two types. I've got the kind that I created natively in AlertSite, which are shown by this kind of building block Lego icon. And then I've got ones that are created from a SOAP UI test case itself. So once they're up on the platform, they run using the same engine, but the creation process, the flow is very different depending on whether you're reusing SOAP UI test cases or if you're creating them from scratch. So I'm going to show it from scratch. Let me just quickly, to get to kind of tie into the last picture you saw from the slide deck. What I'm showing here is the last 24 hours by hour, and you see that I've got some failures here in this segment. So just super duper quick, I want to show you what we show, in that case. So in this case, I clicked in and I'm showing all the runs from that hour, and I've got this failed run, and I can see, right here, we're surfacing exactly what happened. We're basically have a validation failure, and we're missing a very specific element here, which is a missing token from the header of the response itself. So we're able to kind of surface this right up front, so you don't have to go anywhere else to know that that's what's going on. Folks who understand this API, who support this API, will kind of know what to do with that. If it were a network error or a timeout or something else, sometimes that'll provide you everything you need to know which group in your organization would be best able to respond to that. There's a lot more to show in our charting and reporting layer, but we're not going to do that now. Certainly, you can reach out to us and we can show you a little bit more. But this I want to kind of focus on this guy. So I created this monitor, this get alert recipients from API. I created this morning. So you see it only has 4 hours of running. Came in this morning and put this in the account. What this does is it gets the AlertSite alert recipients from our REST API. So this is something that our customers might use, but it provides a good set of talking points and illustrations of kind of some of the concepts that we've covered already. So if I go into the configuration screen for this guy, so what we're going to see now, I can hop to any of my other monitors in this account, but I'm going to hide my sidebar here. So what we're looking at is the sort of the endpoint component of the configuration screen. So if I go to step 1 here, so I've created this 2-step monitor. And then just to kind of show you how relatively easy this is, all I'm doing is making a call to get the token to authenticate against my API. So in this case, I have posted my credentials into the body. I make this post and I get back this access token. So this is the response here. This access token now provides me with kind of a vehicle to show off what we do with these endpoint payloads, if you will. So if I click on this guy now, you see I have the ability to add an assertion or add a variable. I've already done both, but pretty much anything that comes back in the response we can work with. So in this case, I've got an assertion that says that this access token has to be there. So if that's not there, if we get back anything else in the payload, this monitor is going to fail right out of the gate. And that's going to tell us a lot about what's wrong with this API and with this kind of journey that we're taking with these APIs. But in this case, it was successful in my in-browser validation. So the other thing I did was I created a variable. And I'm basically taking this access token that comes back and I'm saving it. And I'm going to be able to use this token in any subsequent step that I create. So that's sort of step 1, pretty straightforward. You can do gets, you can do posts, you can do whatever you need to do to hit that API and kind of get back what you need to continue. If it's a standalone call, that's great. If it requires multiple steps, we can handle that as well. So in this case now, I've got my token, I'm authenticated with the AlertSite platform, and now I can go ahead and do stuff with that. And so one of the APIs we have allows you to get back information about all the recipients that you have in your account. So in this case, you can see these are all the guys I've got. Look, I've got email alerts going to me. Bunch of other groups, our DevOps team, So that's programmatically giving you everything you need to know about the recipients in your account. What we did here to get that is we took that variable from the first step and we basically pasted that guy in right here. So anywhere where the variable can be used from the previous step will light up. Any field that's variable enabled will show this as white. Once you're in there and it's the active cell, it'll turn blue. You can insert that variable. So in this case, that access token variable has been inserted for the token. And that's all we need to do to make any subsequent requests against this API. I can make calls to do all of the administrative functions this API supports. I've chosen to do get recipients here for this one. From that, now we get back the payload that really matters. This is really the key. Make sure that this journey works, right? So in this case now, I've created an assertion that says, the count for the recipients equals 14. Now, obviously, this probably isn't a good assertion because if I add a recipient, the monitor is going to break. But you get the point that anything in this payload can be used to create an assertion. So to make sure that not only is it working, right? We got through step 1, we got through authentication. We're making sure we got back the correct data in the second step, which tells us the API is functionally correct. So this monitor is far superior in terms of making sure that my API infrastructure is working, it's performing, it's doing what it's supposed to do. It's far superior than just pinging that first top level one and making sure I get back at 200, which tells you next to nothing about the overall health of that API. In addition to making sure that this API works, we can also set performance thresholds and make sure that it's coming back in a fast enough manner to be successful. Because we all know now that things that are really slow might as well be failing from an end user perspective. People aren't going to sit around and wait anymore. There are expectations of performance these days, thanks to our improvements in applications, and obviously the bandwidth getting faster and faster every day. So that's kind of it in a super high level nutshell. It is that easy to create these endpoints. We can take a Swagger or an Open API definition, help create the endpoint. In this case, I just did it from scratch, but either one works. Once this is saved, it becomes essentially, it's kind of like a SOAP UI project on the back end from our perspective. But we can go ahead and run this monitor, and this is what ultimately you saw back on the dashboard. I'm going to pause here, see if anyone has any questions specifically about this flow. Amber, anything else that I should cover here that I did not?
No, I think you did a pretty great job. I might mention that there is also a way to add an SLA layer, as Dennis mentioned, how fast that's coming back. These are pieces of information that if you're using AlertSite, you can report on and alert on. So if your API is performing slowly, you'll know about it and you'll have that information in hand. You can also do that for APIs that don't belong to you. I know a lot of our current customers are doing this on APIs that have SLA agreements with them. You can monitor their APIs and be sure that they're responding as quickly as you expect them to and your users need them to.
And just to kind of get into a little more detail quickly on the performance aspect of things, you can create a response time assertion right here. You can also create performance alerts that are a more basic part of the AlertSite platform. There's pros and cons to both approaches. Sometimes you don't want to fail the monitor because it's slow, but you might want to get a performance alert so you can catch it that way. But you have the flexibility to do it either way.
And then one thing I just wanted to highlight real quick is, like, when we're talking about alerts as well, you don't have to necessarily have it send to everybody or to one person. Like, you can go in and send it to different groups of people. So if for example, let's say there's a certain team that is responsible for one specific API or a series of API calls, you can have it send to just that group of people. And make sure that the right people are notified and not necessarily every single person is notified.
Yeah, so real quick to that point, this is our recipient group admin screen. I'm not going to go into all the weeds here because we don't have time, but basically a recipient group is a combination of which monitors or steps of monitors you want to look at, which recipients will get alerted when those monitors fail. We also can filter this out by error type. So if you wanted to, for example, isolate application type errors from network errors, you might have different teams that handle those things. You could do it that way. And then the custom templates allows you to create the payload itself that you get, whether it's in an SMS or JSON post or an email, but you can control how much information is in that payload. And you might want to send a lot of details to the application support teams. You might want to send very few details to management, and you can control that. So there's a lot of flexibility in the configuration of the recipient themselves, as well as these recipient groups. And that combination, along with the monitor settings, really lets you tailor AlertSite to be as sensitive or permissive as you want it to be. But really is what makes our platform super strong from a standpoint of alerting the right folks at the right time. It can be hair trigger, or you can sit a little bit and really make sure that thing's badly broken before it alerts. And it can hit different people at different times depending on how critical things are. So there's a lot of dials, but they're all pretty straightforward. They all can be controlled by folks who have very basic understanding of what's going on. But the monitor creation can be done without code. All of this alert configuration can be done without code as well.
All right. Let me just double check. I know. Oh, someone raised their hand, so let me just select them. But yeah, if you guys have any additional questions, feel free to shoot them into the Q&A just so we can run through them before we run out of time.
Yeah, and obviously, there's a lot more to AlertSite. So if anyone is not an AlertSite customer and wants to get a more complete demo, just let us know. We're more than happy to show it off.
And don't forget, there's a free trial. So if you're not quite ready to interface with us directly, you can go onto the website, get a free trial, and play around with it yourself, and you don't have to ever interact with a human.
Yep, it's for a month, so you have time to really decide whether this will work for your team as well too. So we went through that. I'll just run through this real quick if nobody has any questions. So the main things that we wanted to highlight, like the reasons why teams trust AlertSite. I like to think of synthetic monitoring tools as like an early warning system, and I think the same applies for monitoring your APIs as well. This is something that really gives teams not only a chance to fix it before it becomes a really big problem, but it helps isolate and really provide visibility into what's going on. So particularly how AlertSite helps is it's really easy to get up and running, whether you're a developer or you're not a developer. If you're someone like me, who's I 100% am not a developer, I can do some things, but not a lot of stuff. I can get up and running really quickly in AlertSite and feel confident that I have eyes on the right things. You can get visibility into your entire not only your API performance, but also your API health. I really should change that, is like making sure that you can validate entire API transactions. You can get visibility from all over the world and from within your private network. So that's something that a lot of people will do now too, as well, is making sure that they have eyes on internal APIs that support any of the things that they rely on every day for business critical stuff. And then we went over this a little bit as well, but you can alert the right people and you can alert them immediately. So our alerts send actually right from the node, so you reduce latency between when issues happen and when you actually get that alert. One thing that we didn't cover but could be beneficial for collaboration perspective is you can share monitor tiles. You can have a specific URL that you can send to people so that people can get visibility into that as well without having to go necessarily into the platform, which is helpful. And then you can also automate some of that processes with some of the APIs that we have. So if you want to fit that into your Agile workflow or your CI/CD pipeline, you can do that as well. All right, so we have two other questions I'll run through real quick. One is, do we have on-prem setup as your org is in the Middle East and they don't prefer on cloud? So we do not have necessarily a complete on-premise setup. You can run an endpoint from within your organization, which is something that a lot of teams do as well. I don't know if you want to jump into that, Dennis, a little bit more detail.
I mean, just, in the interest of time,
yeah.
AlertSite is a SaaS platform, flat out. That's everything that's monitored comes back to the SaaS platform. The UI is public website. That being said, you do have the ability to deploy monitoring locations behind your firewall anywhere that you want to monitor from, but the platform itself is SaaS.
Okay. And then someone was asking about HP, APM, and SiteScope as of now. How is the licensing cost different, so that they can discuss with management? So we can actually jump into this with you. The licensing cost really depends on what you're looking to do. So if we wanted to, we can engage with you a little bit more and try and understand what you're trying to do, and we can give you a better idea of what that would cost, because otherwise it's not really an accurate representation of what that would cost. So
yeah, I mean, people spend a very small amount of money with us. People spend a lot of money with us.
Yeah,
it depends on how much monitoring you want to do. We have a kind of a consumption-based model for the public locations, and on the private location side, it's more of a per monitor slot pricing. So, we have customers that do both, some that do one or the other, but that's kind of how it goes. But really, it comes down to what level of monitoring you want to do, and we'd be happy to, kind of work out what the cost would be for your particular situation.
All right. So I know that we're running right up on time. If anybody has any additional questions, we're going to be here, so feel free to shoot them out to us. And if you have some questions that you don't want to go over now, feel free to respond. I'm going to send out a recording of this, so feel free to respond to that email, and I can get back to you with any questions that you have. And then same thing goes for if you guys want to have a more personalized demo, you can respond to that. I'm more than happy to help set that up for you. I know that we skimmed over some of the stuff today because some people were already familiar, some people weren't. So more than happy to do that. let me just see. Okay, so it looks like we answered all of the questions that we have. So other than that, I guess we'll give you guys back the rest of your day. Thanks for joining us. If you guys have any feedback, questions, let us know. Other than that, thanks for joining, and we'll talk to you soon.
Bye.
Thank you.